Hello, I'm John Jeffries. Today I'm going to be speaking about a case that was decided in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal not so long ago. The case concerned a man, John Gleeson, who was an employee truck driver. And the case was about whether he could claim quite substantial deductions in respect of expenditure on food and drink. So the background of the case is this. Mr. Gleeson drove a B-double, which is a big truck with two trailers, and he drove the truck between Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide and Melbourne. His home base was in Sydney, and it was the fact that he was away for a considerable number of nights in the year, around about 270, and one week he will be away 5 nights, and the next week he'd be away, say, 6 nights. And so as he travelled, he would buy food and drink at roadside cafes, roadside petrol stations. And he had to do this because you just can't park a B-double anywhere. And so he would buy them there, and the food wasn't necessarily cheap, and he was a rather big chap, and so he regularly spent nearly $100 a day on food and drink. And so, for the particular year in question, the taxpayer claimed just over $23,000 in respect of the food and drink. Now, the tax office didn't want to permit the deduction and didn't, and so the taxpayer objected against his assessment, and hence the matter came to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Now, just the background of this, in subdivision 900B of the 1997 Act, this deals with the substantiation of work expenses. And in section 900-30, there is the definition of a travel allowance, which is important for the case, which we'll speak about in a moment. Now, what this says is that a travel allowance is an allowance your employer pays or is to pay to you to cover losses or outgoings that you incur for travel away from your ordinary residence that you undertake in the course of your duties as an employee, and that are losses or outgoings for accommodation or for food or drink, or are incidental to the travel, and the travel may be within or outside Australia. Now, in this taxpayer's case, he didn't claim anything for accommodation. The reason for that is that when he slept outside his house, he slept at the truck depots of his employer, or alternatively, he slept in the truck. And so the expenditure was only in relation to food and drink. Now, the position of the tax office was that the amounts were non-deductible because he couldn't substantiate them, and he wasn't receiving a travel allowance. The taxpayer disputed this because he did receive an allowance which was paid at the rate of 5 cents per kilometre that he travelled. And this travel allowance amounted to around about $12,000 in the year. Now, the tax office said that he couldn't claim that deduction because the allowance that he was receiving was not a bona fide travel allowance, as I read out before. Because it was paid on a per kilometre basis, according to the ATO, because it was paid on that basis, it could not then be said that it was paid for covering food and drink. And the tax office also said that the taxpayer was entitled to that allowance whether or not he was sleeping at home on the particular night. And so that was the tax office's position. Now, the matter came to the tribunal, and the tribunal found in favour of the taxpayer, allowing the deductions. What the member of the tribunal said was that just because an allowance is paid at a per kilometre rate doesn't mean that it can't be paid in respect of food and drink. The only evidence that was before the tribunal as to what that 5 cents per kilometre allowance was paid for was the evidence of the payroll manager of the employer, who described that the allowance was paid for the 5 cents per kilometre and it was to cover the costs on travel. So also the tribunal said that the amount that's paid under a travel allowance doesn't have to equate or fully cover the expenses of the employee. And when the term is referred to in the definition of a travel allowance, where it says that it's covered by a travel allowance, that doesn't mean totally covered. That means it's simply dealt with under the allowance. Now, as the taxpayer was paid a travel allowance and the expenditure on the food and drink was reasonable, and it was reasonable because the taxpayer had calculated deductions as per the Commissioner's ruling on the question of what is a reasonable travel allowance. And what is required or not required is that if the travel allowance is reasonable, if the expenditure is reasonable in accordance with the tax office's guidelines and you are paid a travel allowance, then under section 900-50 it says that you can deduct a travel allowance expense for travel within Australia without getting written evidence or keeping travel records if the Commissioner considers reasonable the total of the losses or outgoings you claim for travel covered by the allowance. And because the taxpayer claimed expenditure that was within the reasonable guidelines, and also the evidence supported the fact that he would have spent those sorts of amounts on the food and drink that he consumed, the tax deduction was permitted by the tribunal. So a win for the taxpayer on that occasion. Thank you for watching.